So thank you for joining us this afternoon to think together about the architecture of refugees, the question of ethics. I'll try to be brief. 3 questions. Why now? Why ethics? Why architecture? Why now? Today the world is witnessing the greatest movement of the uprooted that the world has ever known. The United Nations High Commission for Refugee reports that the number of displaced people is at the highest ever, surpassing even post-World War II numbers, when the world was struggling to come to terms with the most devastating event in history. Today, some 65 million people have been displaced from their homes. 20 million of them are in danger, victims of politics, war, or natural catastrophe. According to the HCR, 1% of the Earth population is an asylum seeker, internally displaced, or refugee. Why ethics? Significant transformation in the world political landscape are signaling the emergence of a new world order that undermines the certitude established at the end of World War II. At the core of such discussions, the concept of human rights is significantly challenged, calling for a discussion at the core of ethics, for the revision of the principles and mechanisms of intervention. Many states are flouting international agreements designed to address the refugee question. The United Nations human rights experts are calling on governments around the world to honor their commitments by taking actions for a fairer society. Ensuring human dignity for everyone needs appropriate social justice policies to be implemented, not only domestically but also globally. Their joint statement is as follows. Every human being has the right, every human being has the right to a standard of living that ensures adequate health and well-being for individuals and their families. This includes access to food, clothing, housing, healthcare, and social services. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which sets out these rights, also makes clear that all people are entitled to a social and international order in which their rights and freedoms can be fully realized. In order to achieve sustainable peace in the world, we must all work for social justice in international solidarity. In awarding the Nobel Prize to the ILO in 1969, the Nobel Prize Committee referred to the motto of the international agency: if you want peace, cultivate justice. Why architecture? The workshop addresses the agency of architecture and design in a context where the disrespect of human rights is aggravated by the incapacity of global institutions to react efficiently. What are the ethical questions regarding the architecture of refugees? What timescales, short or long, represent a priority for architecture, and through which agenda? Refugee relief, historical preservation, camps upgrade and daily life, or rebuilding and displacement? Where is the role of design in front of the degradations and destructions of cultural artifacts? How can design be channeled towards peace-building objectives and possible resettlement projects? What are the material, technological, systemic responses to address emergency needs in the context of refugee camps? So I want to thank all of you for being gathered around this table. And I would like to start by one question to all of you guys. The many transformations in the world political landscape have undermined the efforts done at the end of World War II to imagine a set of principles and mechanisms to address issues that engage the responsibility of the world as a community. The creation of the institution of the United Nations in 1945 was an attempt to save succeeding generations from the curse of war, to prevent environmental crises and deterioration, to ensure economic, social, cultural rights to the people. My question is, what is your position in relation to the international framework within which we are operating to consider the issue of the global refugee crisis? Is the intergovernmental organization promoting international cooperation still able to perform its role? Some independent experts, such as Alfred Desires, advocate for reform, while others advocate for the replacement altogether of the United Nations by a federation of the earth, or other institutions. Should we reform or replace the UN? How much the problem is coming from the existence of an institution that is simply not organized to solve global and supranational problems?
That's a good question, I must say. So, yes, UN, I can again share with you my experience. When I was refugee, I was not believing in anything what was happening. And in that specific context, it was really not, within our community, it was not considered as a reliable thing. So you just try to go through your decisions feeling completely alone in that specific case. I must say, I would connect on these rights that you mentioned in your speech. It's I believe there are aspects that we should take into consideration when it comes to intervening and interacting with refugees. We need to consider them as normal people that live normal lives and go through their challenges as we do it here. And in my personal experience, and I think that could be the key for impacting that specific community, is to give them the opportunity to get education, which is maybe fifth point in all that list of rights. I would move it quite up in the list, because this worked for me, but I believe could work for many others, in really allowing people to learn. And you don't need to go far in any of kind of teachings around you to realize that is the key. You need to learn. And if we give them the opportunity to learn, is one of the milestones of that intervention that we should put on our list. And second thing is job. And I'm really surprised how a little or how we use that job issue, that working permit that I was not given, even though I was really very successful, to give the opportunity to live a normal life like any other person in this world. And job is the key of success, in my opinion. So there are two aspects that, again, I dig into my personal life, but I think there are these two aspects that we should work on to actually make real impact and the beauty and difference between what I went through and what these new generations of refugees go through is that we live in a new world, in a digital world that actually offers, gives opportunities to democratize both education and job market. And I think these are directions that, again, give us opportunity to treat refugee as a normal. I like to cite Hamdi Chobani words in which he says, once you give a job to a refugee, he is not anymore a refugee. And this is really a striking statement, and I totally share that statement, because eventually what we need to do is to give every single person in this world the opportunity to live their lives, and not putting sticks into the wheels through all these working permit issues, migration issues. That's my vision and I don't know if I answered your question, but I think it's important that we discuss this together.
This is a very large question, but something that well, those of us who are trained in international law, we of course have been sort of both responsible for the crisis with the meltdown of the system that you correctly identified, but also thinking about and imagining alternatives. There have been enough proposals for replacement, for example, the intergovernmental system with other sorts of options. If, for example, a framework based on cities or a framework based on direct election of individuals, kind of a world parliament of a sort, doing away with the global coordination entirely, but instead have horizontal networks, actually essentially deterritorialized networks, essentially link with each other on a functional basis. There have been all sorts of proposals over the years, but I remain, my feet are kind of on the ground in many ways, and I like to see proposals that might have a plausible way of, working themselves out in the real world. In the real world, I do think that it's very hard to see the entire disappearance of something called a nation state. And I also think that it might not necessarily be a good idea for something called a nation state to disappear. For a variety of different reasons, people who live in particular territories remain committed to identification with their fellow, members based on some sort of identification, based on some imagined past or imagined traditions of some kind, and they actually constitute a very powerful pull factor that brings people together. And the structure of rules that we have that impose obligations on countries are built on the relationship between these kinds of communities, self-imagined communities that constitute themselves as states. At least in the near future, I don't see at least alternatives emerging that are robust enough to completely replace the current system. What we might end up having, of course, is the simultaneous presence of perhaps many different forms of governance emerging. And here, what I would say, particularly as it comes to refugees, is there needs to be a reinvestment of time and effort into rebuilding the global framework. The reality is that the global frameworks that were established in the 1940s have slowly lost their ability to influence events on the ground and to be effective. And there needs to be more of a reinvestment of effort and time into rebuilding and re-innovating those global institutions. Perhaps, as I referred to earlier during my presentation, if the new global compacts that are going to be adopted, if things go well, on migration and refugees in 2018 are structured, sufficiently, engineered sufficiently broadly and effectively, perhaps they might be able to address some of the issues that ultimately lead to refugee flows. Because the fact that we need a global organization and a global normative framework for dealing with migration as a whole, not simply refugees, has been known for quite a while. Many years ago, Jagdish Bhagwati, economist at Columbia University, made a call for a global organization on migration and called for compacts between countries and regions that would essentially allow for a free movement of population around the world. Similar to, for example, the assumption that we have that goods and services should have free movement around the world, essential foundation of free trade theory. He was essentially making the argument that, we need to think about the movement of, labor and movement of people around the world as a free circulating, commodity, essentially. That, of course, he was coming at it from an economic perspective. But the proposals have been there for a while. And so I'm very curious to see how the new redesign of institutions is going to work out. The only other thing I would say about, in the light of what I said earlier in my remarks, the one thing I would say about the limits of the current system, which I do think will continue in one form or another, meaning the system of nation states. One of the major limits of the current system is the exclusive and untrammeled right that it gives to nation states to decide who comes in and who goes, the complete control they have over territory, and going with that, their ability to determine essentially what happens to populations who live within them. The question of, especially as I said earlier, the ethics of intervention issue. How do you intervene in situations where massive atrocities are happening that are generating refugee flows that are crossing frontiers is actually one of the most vexing moral and political questions of our time, for which there is no easy answer. Conceptually, some of the breakthrough work was done by Francis Deng, who was the first UN special representative on IDPs. When he and others came up with the formulation of sovereignty, not as a right of countries, but as a responsibility. That the idea that sovereignty should have responsibility is an idea that was quite seriously pushed by many scholars and policy people for almost close to 2 decades, from the late 90s, until the UN General Assembly actually acknowledged that in the form of something called R2P, or Responsibility to Protect Doctrine. Unfortunately, because, as I said earlier, of the unreliable and abusive record of the West in using any humanitarian argument that comes its way for its own selfish purposes, and because of the fact that we don't have global systems that can ensure that abuse of that kind of, those arguments can be prevented. For example, Security Council reform completely solved. Because of these institutional deficiencies, although conceptually we have actually some very interesting ways forward to reform the system that came in the 1940s, we are yet not able to operationalize them. That to me remains one of our biggest challenges.
I actually would like to pick up a little bit on what Raj was saying, because I don't know if I'm equipped in the same way that you are to speak to the UN as an institution or even as a lasting one, but perhaps more through the work or understanding a bit of Rwanda on the ground. The critique, for me, is of the dominant or conventional approaches to such issues such as peace building, and questioning kind of international philosophies or even best practices or typical practices when it comes to dealing with either refugees or with post-conflict situations. So in the case that I work in, it's the issue of peace building in Rwanda. So the question here is not only the ethics of if we should intervene, it is more fundamentally, I think, or as fundamentally, a question of how we should intervene. And that becomes a true ethical dilemma if we start to question the real foundations or the motivations, or even the ethics of peace building as they're commonly understood. So this becomes where I can start, or others can start to mount a critique of orthodoxy, of liberal peace building orthodoxy in this case. So that was the first set of reactions, I suppose, that came in response to the question. And then I think the question also engages a bit with this distinction or set of debates between a universalist versus a particular or relativist approach to ethics, right? So there would be a set of philosophers or thinkers who would say that, who would start to question fundamentally for whom or what is the universal idea of peace, or where is that ethics? Who designs, defines the ethics from which we operate? For whom does that ethics operate? In what context, in which historical time is a particular set of ethics developed? And that would be a kind of communitarian, perhaps, approach to understanding a universal view, right? And then the universalists might then contest that and say, well, particularity or relativism devolves into a kind of more insular or closed set of ethical standards or moral standards or values, which has its extreme example in Nazism. So this is the typical counterexample between the universalist and the particularist perspective. But then again, we might say, we counter that again by saying, within any one society or historical time or space or place, any one country, any society, we can take and understand that Nazism, bigotry, racism does not exist in a vacuum. There are other dissenters within that society. There's a way to challenge that set of views or values as not morally worthy. So, that's another way of thinking about this. It's a kind of an unending dilemma between a particular point of view and a universal, and negotiating between those. But perhaps, in the end, what's important here is to always question the universal, to question the convention, question the dominant point of view. And one way to start to maybe perhaps do that is to start to connect the ethics with the politics, and to have them work with each other. And in that case, intervention and how we intervene and the evaluation of that intervention, so what is actually being done and what impacts it has, that's perhaps where we start to feed back into that universal set of debates. So it's not just theory, it also has to do with people on the ground.
I mean, I will talk from the architectural point of view, right? Because what I think is that what we cannot deny is that basically the culture in which we operate as architects and or as curators or cultural process, somebody that is working on the cultural process of architecture, and that reality. Organizations like global organizations, let's say, organizations that has the spirit of operating globally, have an impact on the people, right? And definitely are part of the landscape. But I would, the first thing I would say is that as an architect, I think that it's important to evaluate also the role of other agents in the construction of the built environment today, right? And when we are looking at corporate organizations, right, that might have a similar impact that the UN is having in a specific moment, right? Or we can imagine specific moments of exception, right, in which the normative processes of negotiation of sovereignty are being suspended. For example, I'm thinking now of Kelly Sterling work on extra statecraft, right, and how actually elements that are above the state are actually modifying certain regulations or certain operations that affect our built environment. And by saying that affect the built environment, I'm referring that it affects the migration processes, right? If there is something that is accelerating and operating in our daily lives, not only in specific groups that we can indicate as refugees, we are all in a certain level connected and affected by transit, right, and migration. So I think that the first thing I would say is that combination of, yes, the UN might be one of the agents, but we should, as architects, understand that is not the only agent that is being modifying certain things. But my second response to it is how the importance of organizations, right? And I agree with you that the importance of understanding new forms of organizational processes, right? And how organizations can really affect situations that we are discussing today. And in that sense, I would refer back to the project of the embassy as something that was an organization produced in a specific moment with a state behind, and with a specific agency, and with the capacity to find a breach in the system in order to operate. Right. So I think that in the understanding of what is the role of the UN or the role of these kind of organizations, we have to rethink new forms of agency that can be produced with organizational systems or construction of community that are not following the same systems that we have known in previous cases or in bigger examples.
Yeah, I would maybe try to bring this very difficult questions, into also more an understanding, for example, in my personal case of United Nations Relief Work Agency, which is the agency that was created ad hoc for Palestinians, refugees. And of course, most of the Palestinians, let's say, have a sort of hate relations with this UN agency. So, in one way, of course, is the agency that perpetuated, in some form makes sustainable their refugeehood, and the fact that doesn't have any political mandate, it perpetuates this sort of humanitarian dimensions. At the same time, if you say that you're going to dismantle UNRWA today, they'll say no. So, and I think what this says to me is that I think we don't have shortcut solutions. The only political struggle that I know is to work with the present colonial conditions and trying to reinvent from there possibility for different users, which is what the Palestinians, for example, did in the camps, and what also they did with UNRWA since years. If you also read the history of UNRWA, it's not this monolithic idea of UN has its own history. And it's been pulled, in so many different directions. Until today, for example, Israel will be the first one, will be happy to dismantle UNRWA, to say Palestinians, they are like anyone else. So I think it's good to be careful, in trying to understand how we get out from the situations which we all feel we are trapped into this idea of a nation state that most of the people, I would say, would agree that doesn't work. So some people say, we can reform. Some people, we have to think everything. I would, more modestly in the way how we approach that. Also, I will talk more from an architectural perspective, so I will not get lost. Is how we reuse, for example, the World Heritage of UNESCO, for example. So we were very much interested on the history of refugee camp. And we could have made, that claim to be, the importance of that. But we said, why don't we actually really build the evidence and make a case using the application format that UNESCO is providing, in order for states. By the way, only state can nominate World Heritage Site. I mean, I don't think we have, criticizing that it's so easy. I mean, how you can have a universal claim when then it's the only nation state can nominate what everybody or the universe should agree that is actually a World Heritage Site. It's such an easy critique. I think we cannot stop there. I think our task is actually how to use that structure, to be worked in a way that both is practically effective. At the same time, it leads us to a different place. And the way how this was done, I mean, in our case it worked, it was in some way accepting that as if you have to accept that you inhabit a colonial building. And the history of decolonization is such an interesting history that, we know very little, or at least, the West know very little about it, that could give so many important lessons in the way how you use a structure that was built with certain aims, and you turn it on its head for different aims, with all the difficulties, of course, of doing that operation, and there is no easy solution for that. But in this case, for us, was a way to mobilize a different understanding of what constitutes heritage, that this discussion is to happen, and more importantly, who has the right to say that is heritage or not? I would challenge to say that why an old city, let's say in a place, is more important than the Haitian refugee camp with its history of 70 years old, which is inscribed in its urban fabric and can be narrated and can make and has a relevance for the world. It's not just a relevance for the nation itself. And I think when we start to look at these strategies, I would say we already realize that we are beyond the nation states, because there are so many people already live, I think they already live, in a conditions that is beyond the nation state. And what is today, do we really believe that the Middle East will go back into a nation state? I don't think so. These boxes will not, it's very painful, because, we know how it's painful not to be a citizen, not to be covered by this nation state. But, it will be also very, I think, similarly, it's an illusion to think that the Middle East, you get Syria back again, and you get Iraq back again. Lebanon maybe was never really a state. What is Israel? Is a nation state? Where is its territory? That, for example, if you look carefully at that area, you understand that we use, again, a way to understand things that actually, they don't already fit the reality, because the majority of the Palestinians, they don't live they're already all carrying different nationalities. So they are de facto already living beyond this nation state, of course, paying heavy consequences of that. But to me, is what we can learn from that condition in order then to build something different, than then trying to fix back something that will never go back.
Thank you. Let's move on from the question of ethics and politics and the sort of intertwined condition. It's who decides what is heritage, who decides what's a sort of symbolic structure, and what are the repercussions of doing that, and how do communities relate to this political decision is a very deep and very interesting question. I would like to move on from this sort of question about frameworks to a question about intervention and transformation. So in relation to the process of reconstruction of a community after war, after a traumatic event, how is it possible to imagine that they are on the ground conflicting forces that will try to build a sort of consensual space? My question is maybe to Delia, Alessandro, and maybe Admir. How do you start with conflicting forces on the ground and wish and have the wish to build a collective space?
These are big questions. So how do you start with conflicting forces on the ground to build a kind of consensus of sorts, or consensual space? In Rwanda, it's an interesting type of question, because consensus is developed top-down and distributed and decentralized. There is no real consensus. It's an autocratic space. And so you dissent at your peril. There's very strong repercussions for doing so. So in a way, I think a lot of my work in Rwanda is focused on finding small places, small utterances, even that are not vocalized. Perhaps that's stronger. But oftentimes, as understood through the built environment, as a form of resistance, as a form of difference, as an articulation of affiliation with a government policy, or an agreement at the same time, but I'd rather do it this way. So an example here would be any number of the model villages. I mentioned briefly one of them, where the government has a very clear idea, a gridded settlement with very rational principles of equally spaced houses with uniform design, placed in a tabula rasa, and everyone must come to resettle and conform. But when you do that, when you operate on a model of consensus and you don't listen to difference in communities in which are being cobbled together by the resettlement, then you miss the different histories and experiences of the individuals and the families that are being brought together. And you miss the opportunities to try and foster forms of reality, neighborliness, etc. And you end up antagonizing a lot of tensions. I'm speaking a bit in generalities, and I don't have time here to go into more specifics, but I suppose the idea here is to find ways to listen to dissensus, to allow conflict to be read, and also to find ways to think about forming community that are not just somehow talked about.
Maybe without this, I don't know what you have in mind, without disrupting, let's say, these conversations, but also I felt a little bit, they have been so patient. I was wondering if also there is a moment that we can, get a little bit of questions that will be also from outside, so that we can open up and yeah, I'm very curious to hear also, since we have been talking a lot, and I'm enjoying that very much, but also I felt I would like to hear a little bit more from the public, if possible, if it's not disrupting.
Oh, okay, so we'll open up the floor to questions from the public.
Hi, thank you so much for the wonderful presentations and just having a space here to talk about these very, very large and complex questions. I wanted to just further complicate it by asking about, we're talking about ethics, but it's a little confusing for me because the question of ethics is always associated with the question of who is the so-called agent, to whom this ethical framework should apply. We've talked about international institutions, international legal frameworks, but we've talked about, of course, the role of architects and people who are producing spaces. But as I understand it, refugees are big business as well. There's a whole industry that has been developed over the last few decades around serving the needs of refugees and of internally displaced people in urban and rural areas. These refugee camps have huge supply chains associated with them, huge development actors, and many of us here in academia are also in the business of both representing, creating knowledge about, and responding to the needs and crises of various disasters or wars as they come up in the last few decades. And this is a recurrent thing. So I'm just curious from, just if each of you could take just like 1 or 2 minutes to reflect on this question of ethical praxis as an individual and where you see some of the challenges of negotiating the unethical dimensions of the various actors who are at play and who have an interest in both perpetuating the problem because it makes them money, or creates opportunities to write books about it, and where in your own personal practice you find some kind of still space to operate and address these concerns.
I think that's a great question. At least as an international lawyer, human rights lawyer, who works a lot with governments, communities, and also having worked in a post-conflict setting after war in Cambodia for many years, I can say, at least as far as my position is concerned, some of the biggest quandaries actually come from the fact that human rights, while they express ethical values, I've been a human rights lawyer for 25 years now, they express ethical values. Human rights talk is not the same thing as ethics talk. Those are two different things. Partly because of, well, because of many reasons, but I'll point to one reason why this is important. Human rights are expressed, and have salience and have traction because they're expressed as obligations of states. And otherwise, it's a bunch of pious aspirations that we can all ignore, basically. This will be no different from, for example, a bunch of obligations that religious people call for. I mean, it can be any form of, call for rightful conduct. The reason why human rights have a particular purchase on public policy in particular, and on political action, why people are able to mobilize around them, and they're able to use institutions, such as in Palestine. Constantly there's a reliance on human rights. Why? Because of the link with law, and that link with law provides a link with state. While that's its strength, I've always felt that in my practice it's also the main weakness, because it limits us to the boundaries and the frameworks that are implied by our very reliance on the state. To be committed to the idea that we have to realize ethics through rights talk also actually restricts you to the range of possibilities implied in that the mechanism called the state. You're over-reliant on it, and it's not possible to escape it beyond a point. So what people like me have tried to do is to strategize about how to keep the state while trying to sort of weaken some of its worst impulses in one way or the other. Or how to find strategic opportunities to, for example, seep some of the resistance from non-state spaces, such as by social movements or others, into the spaces that are traditionally occupied by state-led elites. How do we actually disrupt that? And that's actually one that can be done only by practice. I think that's, to me, one of the big challenges.
Yeah, I would say, again, talking from the architectural point of view, that also there are different levels of how you respond to this issue, right? I believe, as an architect, I believe in the importance of bringing the discussion to the table as the first step towards all these questions that you are putting on the table, right? We have to think, for example, when we started with the After Belonging project, none of these issues were broadly discussed in schools of architecture, literally, right? No, there are examples of certain practices that have been developing these kind of discussions, but as a general understanding of what architecture was no discussion whatsoever about human rights or the importance of understanding migration as part of what you need to deal with as an architect, right? So I think that there are different reactions of how your practice operates and different levels of operation. So I think, and in relation to that, I would come back to the question of organizations before, right? The power or capacity that the Aga Khan Foundation can have, for example, it's a big agent, right? It can produce a big modification and constructing processes of ethics that can be broadened up to the discipline of architects, right? So I believe in the importance of gestures and positions that you might have as an individual or as a group of people that are having a conversation today here, and that can have consequences in a major scale, and a bigger scale. Because at the end of the day, what I believe is in the importance of understanding that architecture has the tools and the techniques to really confront complex issues, right? Because that's something that somehow it's been conventionally understood that architecture is somehow a discipline that is relegated from these issues, or is separated from complexities as big as migration, right? And that doesn't mean that architecture is the response, but definitely architecture is embedded in it and has the capacity to test out or rehearse certain processes.
I think I could connect with this aspect of state versus globalization, both aspects that were mentioned, and I think we have the opportunity to explore that new dimension of globalization through new tools, digital tools, to actually go beyond borders. I think this, at least in a sense of conversation and exchange of information, I think this could be the new dimension that we should start exploring more systematically. Let's put it in this way: find a way that the state is not controlling refugee camp in Jordan in terms of access to internet. We need to find a way to actually have voice of all together, bring it into a conversation, and be able to find the tools that are recognized universally to start conversation about all these ideas and have voice from everyone when it comes to conversation about all these issues.
Questions?
Thank you so much for great presentations. I think we've been talking a lot about nations, nation-states. There's an interesting tension. If we let go, if we move past the nation-state, are we letting that scale of governance, of ability to act, off the hook? There's an inherent stability or a perception of stability and protection. Infrastructure, building codes, reliable standards. If we increasingly move towards impermanence, informality, incrementality, fluidity, what do we gain and what do we lose? Simple question.
If I can just comment on this, I think it's a natural way of what we observe in economy or any other field where technology is impacting seriously our Italian mafia taxi network that is completely upset by Uber. Okay, so what I think is really the opportunity to bring this conversation into a new dimension, new space, that again will be defined altogether, but will give us the opportunity to go beyond these obstacles that I lived seriously through all my steps, from refugee camp to MIT professorship here. And I think, again, it's a new dimension that is, again, upsetting Italian taxi drivers, and could upset many people, but actually, maybe when it comes to ethics, is a new dimension that would bring us into unexplored territories, and also opportunities to make this world better when it comes to 65 million refugees that are right now living in those countries.
In the interest of time, getting more questions, I think I should just.
Thank you for your talk. I had a question from a sort of economic point of view. So I've just finished Paul Collier's book on sort of migration generally and what can be done with it. And he argues that the West shouldn't accept more migrants because I think he quotes the figure that 10% of all migrants or all sort of asylum seekers receive $75 billion per year of benefits from the rest of the world, while 90% receive only $5 billion. And so he argues that instead of that effectively the money would be best spent being sent to local countries, and that so I suppose the extension would be that spending money on expensive designs in the West it's very economically inefficient and it doesn't produce the maximum benefit. And so I'm wondering how can a sort of ethical or rights-based approach provide an answer to something which might be economically very efficient, but perhaps sort of would contribute to sort of colonial processes that are continuing to go along. And then secondly, if this is the case, is this a question that architecture can answer, or is that something different?
Let's maybe take one.
Yeah, Jimmy?
Thanks, and I've enjoyed each of the presentations, and I've been trying to wonder how they might relate to one another in some kind of a coherent way, and because each one of them has a perspectives, and I try to kind of comprehend how the human rights laws discourse is related to architecture in camps or architecture in conflict transformation situations. And I'm kind of struggling at the moment, and yet I found one of the things that Delia said to be a concept that's fairly well established in different fields of work related to these issues, which is that of peace building. And it means so many things, and yet it also has this construct of building, which is central to architecture. And I haven't seen an architectural development of the concept of peace building that relates to the field that what the people in the conflict and peace studies movement do in peace building. I think there's a lot of potential here, and I'm curious to hear what the panel thinks. Thanks.
I think you should answer the question rather than just connecting them, because they might go in different directions. So whoever has an answer to the question of this gentleman has to answer it now.
Like not to be.
Yeah. I appreciate all the questions very much. I think I perhaps could speak a little bit more to the last question. So this is precisely, I think, what the larger project that I'm working on attempts to do, to uncover the extent to which a spatial conceptualization, but also the extent to which spatial practices are implicated in the term peace building itself. And I trace it from the 1990s to a number of different figures, including Boutros Ghali, who I pictured in the presentation, the former UN Secretary General, through to foremost peace thinkers, including John Paul Lederach. Yeah, exactly. Right, and who used explicitly architectural metaphors and the construction process to describe what peace building might be. So I look at that ethic, I think really critically for me, is to look at the materialization, the materiality and the spatiality of ethics, not only as a way of understanding what ethics might be, how we should live, but also to evaluate and interpret the impacts of practices that are organized in the name of an ethic.
Very quickly, actually on the same issue, and then I'll come back to this. I think that peacebuilding might work for some purposes, particularly post-conflict. But if you're looking at refugee issues as a broader one, in which you're looking at not only the ethics of how do you respond to refugees once they become refugees, but also how do you actually respond, act in the first place to prevent refugee flows. How do you deal with the structural issues that you all referred to and I talked about? Peace building may not be sufficient. There is a second issue, which is that peace building is typically used in the context of post-conflict states. That's an international terminology, but as I said, by and large, right now, there are a lot more internally displaced people compared to refugees, and they also have similar issues concerning, for example, conflicts with communities. How do you actually rebuild? And the resettlement issue comes up all the time between host communities and so-called internal refugees. We've seen that in this country after Katrina, for example. And these issues have to be captured through some other framework as well. But very quickly on the economic side of migration, Is there a rights-based approach? I would think that, I would hope that there is. A purely economic case for migration has actually been made long time ago. In fact, OECD and the World Bank have published volumes establishing the positive benefits of migration, agreed upon migration between countries, firmly establishing, for example, that migration of all types have a net benefit between countries. So that's not an argument that we need to make anymore. Intellectually, that argument is over. The issue is to figure out how to operationalize that particular insight in a way that actually assures governments that still believe that as a government they need to have some security over their borders. And others who believe that in fact we can benefit by agreements between countries where people can transit through. So perhaps the Global Migration Compact has to deal with issues like that.
And I think the argument is not so much whether migration is good or not for the economy. It's about how you spend the money that you're spending on refugees, and whether it's best spent in the West, where it's more expensive, or where it's more efficiently spent close to the source.
Right. Although the most of the money that is in, because the word migration signifies that we're talking about a larger category of people, not just refugees. And for example, you're talking about voluntary migration for economic reasons.
I think they're referring directly to refugees.
Right. Perhaps that's a much more limited issue, yeah.
Maybe, I don't know, maybe picking up from this very last discussion, also trying to challenge the idea that these are also part of this peace building and humanitarian intervention, to say we have to spend money there because, so they do not come here. Actually, it's exactly the opposite, there will be an increasing, of course, because the more people have access to things and the more, they will be mobile, I would say, fortunately. So, and I think we are still struggling, and that's why maybe, I would like to challenge also the idea of trying still to frame, refugees as a sort of crisis, as something that, exploded just, some years ago, and framing this, also historically, and to me, is important, to see that, and yeah, I have to say, I'm uncomfortable thinking there is something that can be called, this architecture of peace, of peace building. Because I cannot see how that could have a critical angle that recognize that we are dealing with, larger colonial present situations that, and I see this so-called migration of refugee crisis as part of, empire that collapsed, and why people are so surprised that, the same people who are part of this empire now are going back to, they want to go to the metropolis. I don't understand, why we don't see that as a larger 500 year of colonization of Western society. And it's a time, and this will be painful, and it's happening. And it's a time in which, the kind of white privilege, will be, should be put into questions. And instead of, turning again the situation as if that is a kind of things that can be fixed, and it is a problem that, as Israel is trying to do with the wall, now you have Trump, instead of understanding, things in this way and reacting in this way, I think we have to start recognizing to build an understanding of that as something that can be traced back to years ago, and because that starts then fundamental question about, sovereignty. It's funny for me to see, I have to say, sorry if that sounds too polemical, but this is what I believe. But that someone that was a migrant itself, can claim sovereignty in this country, I really don't get that. It really disturbed me. But I understand that, for some people that is normal. That someone, that was himself a migrant, today wants to decide who can be in and outside of this country. I mean, what about the native population of this country would say? I mean, where we start this conversation? Where do we start? I want to start, for me, what it seems important about these claims, Unfortunately, I have to say, I'm rather optimist on this. Because, before we could not have these conversations. I still think, it's very delicate, and I see that some of my friends, when I start talking this way, they became very irritated. I'm learning that. But also I feel finally it's a conversation is happening, that we start to have an historical perspective on events that happen, and then really asking fundamental question. I mean, who has the right of, say, deciding who can be in and who can be out? And to me, also this idea that someone, about hospitality of refugees and asylum, I mean, if you see that in a different frame, for example, I think about Italy. Italians, they don't have any perception when people left Libya, what was the colonial relation that Italy had with Libya? They don't see, they don't know, there is no acknowledgement that Italians, displaced 2/3 of the population of Libya. It was involved there not only in colonialism, it was the worst colonialism because it was fascist colonialism. So they invented camps, they used the Italian words to describe the way in which you fence places. Why? Because that's what Italy brought. And now if they see a so-called migrant living a boat from Italy, they don't put this in that colonial conditions that made Italy what is it today. So I think that is, to me, a conversation needs to happen.
So, yeah, Alessandro, I think so to sort of think about the top-down approach, whether it's a framework that is at the scale of the state or at the scale of at the global scale. It seems that a lot of problems remain unsolved on the table. Whether people are really looking for ethical positions or are looking for overarching economical interests. So I'm wondering, whether you can talk about, another approach, which is a sort of bottom-up approach, very concrete, and very specific interventions, and maybe your practice in particular in this camp. How is your contribution? How is your intervention related to this question of building a possible future within a camp that is already a kind of territorial aberration? What I mean is, how do you how can you, how through your practice are you able to both have a critical position, but at the same time provide a space for people? And how can, there is a sort of paradox there, that I totally understand that you sort of try to work out this paradox, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about what is this school for, and what's the general framework, and what's the future of that school, and is that the correct response?
Yeah. Without this sense, it's also a very big question, so I'm not sure I have the answer for these questions, but let's say something that it really let's say was something that helped us to guide these processes that, by the way, are always very compromised from the very beginning, and this is why I said it was important. I was interested to come here today because and going back also to the ethical questions, I think no one could claim in the moment you decide to step in a situations, that you are, in a kind of positions, in which you will not make mistake, or actually you are contributing. That is all the dilemma of all these NGO organizations. How much they are perpetuating certain situation, but also how much is trying to challenge. So, first of all, it's a very, very compromised situations. Where actually the ethical questions are very important, are very important, how much, why, there is moment, and this also, it seems to me, that fortunately is changing, how also among architects, finally, they start to say no, imagine in our professions as architects, we only say yes, and we have even architects say the yes architecture of things like that, it's obscene, the profession is so clear that you actually, you question the things that you are, doing. And I hope that one day, there will be a tribunal for a court for people that participate to these crimes. and they should go to jail, not because they just have, a project in that country, it was an occasion for that. I think this has to do in the way also how we, there is a process that has to happen, in the way how we frame problems. And for me, one of the key words is definitely the words of decolonizations, because that is not just, the struggle of the 60s, people getting rid of the colonial empire, but it was also about, how the white society are still framing things, and we are still participating, understanding problems using the same colonial framework. I think that is something different, that this word today, in that specific situations, I want to understand the refugees transgressing borders as a fight for decolonization that is not happening now anymore in the Kasbah of Algeria. It's actually happening on the border and the Mediterranean. That is where it's happening. I only can see that. That for me gives me a different perspective in the way how I can work, instead of, at the best having this bad intention to say, we have to asylum and all this hospitality. What hospitality? That is a right, with all what Europe did and never paid for this. I mean, that would be the minimum that needs to happen, in that sense. So I think, and this is a work that in an academia setting, for example, this is a discussion that that we have to have.
I mean, let me follow up 1 second on that, because it's true, architecture is always complicit, no? And maybe complicitness it's an interesting word to discuss here, right? Because what I found fascinating about your presentation was when you were starting to talk about the camp as that space that is a city, but it's not a city. It's dense, but it has like walls around. So like and what is fascinating about your practice is actually that you can understand the intervention that you and your team has produced is somehow can be understood as an experiment that can be applied to two different situations, right? Where ethics are applicable, where conflictivity is in front of you, and where complicitness is inevitable, right? And I think that's what it's interesting for me to understand what you were saying about how ethics are starting to become part of the discussion, right? And because suddenly, like all these elements that you needed to discuss and you needed to have because it was like necessary almost. And becomes almost like a model, right? So I think that for me, that is where the practices like yours can become like constructing certain models of operations that, of course, inevitably will have to be modified and tested out, etc., etc. But I feel that when we're talking about ethics, they don't go beyond the fact of looking at specific practices that have been operating with complicitness or inevitably negotiating complicitness and looking how that can be operative elsewhere.
All right, so one last question and then we are out of time.
Thank you for this last point. Mamdouh Mamdani wrote very beautifully about this decolonization. You might want to look at it, but Trevor Noah, the comedian, has a clip that I would suggest that everyone watches about the effect of post-colonization or decolonization and the relationship of refugees to the countries that colonized them in the beginning. I have two very specific questions, one to Delia and one to Alessandro. Delia, I want to go back to the point that somebody said that we are past it and we don't want to go back to it, but it seems to me that it's an extremely important one. And that you said at some point that ethics cannot exist in radical separation from politics. But this is sort of like a relationship of equality, in a sense, in the statement that you have given in here. I would actually challenge you to think through saying politics cannot exist without ethics, but ethics has to be able to exist without politics. Has to be actually able to exist pre-politics in order to inform politics, because once you relativize ethics, we lose that notion that Raj was speaking about, which is the notion of, not Raj actually, I'm sorry, that El Hadi was speaking about, that if you want peace you have to cultivate justice, and justice, the basic principle of justice is that it has to be universal, so I would cling to the claim of a universal ethics as the basis of ethics rather than a relative ethics, whatever that is. The application perhaps is different, but we need to be able to have principles. And if I may ask my question to Alessandro, because it's related, it's very much related, as a matter of fact. You had this collective dictionary, and I collected from the image that you have common vision, responsibility, relations, well-being. Some 25 years ago, two thinkers in Syria did a book that was supported by the European Union. It was called The Basis of Citizenship. And one of them was actually a thinker, the other was a painter artist. And the painter artist rendered these principles, and the thinker was actually writing down very watered down, but still very intelligent definitions of what is a citizen and what are the rights of citizenship. You have been speaking about that very difficult situation Palestinians found themselves in a camp, being non-citizens but having a land that they can call home, camp in this case. What are you trying to do with this collective dictionary? Are you developing sort of like some principles for a different definition of the individual relationship to the collectivity and to the land on which he or she are living? That is not citizenship, given the fact that citizenship is denied the Palestinians in the camps.
No, thank you for your question, and I appreciate that very much. It's something that is a central conflict to the work that I'm engaging with, and I think a lot of our work as well, as we encounter these different circumstances and situations in which we have some severe ethical challenges and that require political solutions, but also a kind of return to a set of principles that might guide through political obstacles. Exactly. Yeah. So my point here, I guess, is that one, that ethics and politics should remain in radical dialectical tension, right? That the universal and the particular should always inform each other. And so that's why I at first say that they should be not radically considered separated.
That's a much better phrasing than the one that I was going at.
They should be in radical dialectical tension. In the same way that we could start to question who defines the universal, for whom and at whose cost, right? And in that sense, the particular is always informing the universal, but also the universal is also informing the particular, in holding the particular to account. Particular sets of values within a particular society, let's say, that would seem to diverge from what we might consider to be ethical or morally permissible. So I consider them in radical tension in that sense. I'll leave it there. There were other parts of this conversation, but I want to leave Alessandro some time to talk. Is that okay?
So very quickly, what is a collective dictionary? I say four fundamental things. And maybe some of them are also changing, with time, because it was such an incredible work that, I think I'm still reflecting on. First, it was the idea, as I said, to say, what is a camp? Because, we don't know what is a camp. It's strange, but, it's the first desire was that, for me, was really to understand and to see the camp as a source of knowledge. Not to say this is like just garbage, these are just marginalized, this is just humanitarianism, we know all of that. I think we have to accept that these are incredible place in which knowledge is produced, and I would say also political structures. The second thing, which is fundamental, is I saw the power in the participants in campus and camps when they recognized they were creators of meanings. Some of them, have been in normal universities, and the knowledge that they get from these universities alienate them from their realities. They were going back to their places, and they didn't know what to do with that knowledge. What we did at campus and camps, that to me was the most tangible things, and it was so difficult to explain to the German development, because they want to know, to give us some tangible thing. The tangible thing was that the moment they made the click, that they see themselves as in their own experience, whatever they were experience, but in a way that they can actually define what they see, define the world that is surrounding them. And there are actually some people listening to them because they start them to invite them in Birzeit University, in Al-Quds University, in other universities in Palestine to talk, to speak. You know, you start to realize how much that is actually an incredible, powerful tool. Because, you know, they start to do something that they didn't know that we're actually able to do it. And you know, I don't have time now to explain the whole process, but it was very painful because they had, you know, we all have to go first into an unlearning what we think we know, and then we can relearn, you know, what actually we experience and bridge a little bit the gap between our experience in the world and the way how we speak about the world. The third thing, of course, is to say what we discovered there is not just important from the camp. You know, from the camp, I really understood, for example, why, you know, I've studied in university, or let's say in a political environment, which the public was always good. You know, if you do something for the public, it's always great. I realized that the public, you know, in a colonial context, is actually your enemy. So, and then, you know, it opened up completely a different understanding then of, I cannot live between the private and the public, because in between, there are so many forms of collectivity. And because we are stuck into this nation-state idea, we think there is only private and public. And we don't recognize that, for example, in Palestine, during the Ottoman Empire, you have the Masha, you have so many different collectivity. And to me, the camp is today maybe a new form to think about the Masha. You know, a form of collectivity that is not, you know, it's not state-based and it's not private. It exists only because people like in the Masha were farming the land. Now they are in the camp and they are producing something that can be collected. So, for example, in English it's translated like the common, but you know, that was a discussion that happened, that was a word in Arabic. And imagine also how that was for them so important to say, you know, I know something. I can write something about this, you know, and I'm not just this, you know, refugee that doesn't know anything, right? So that was very, very important. And then the last thing is a phrase that, you know, because we were doing this and we didn't know really also how we collectively were understanding that process. And some of them, you know, interpret that as a way to write or rewrite, you know, what look like a constitution. And this, I thought, you know, it was also a very powerful moment which they understood that we're organizing not just, you know, a small group, but they were trying to make sense of the political institutions that exist in the camp. You know, and that, for example, is not just important in the camp when we want to think about what is beyond the nation state. I mean, how you organize a community in which the state is not involved. And the very last point, you know, to say how that is important, we understand only refugees through the state, you know, what the state does. If you look at the history, I mean, this is, again, is not new. So when there were no states, actually, you know what, were people, the tribe, in the Arab world, for example, how is important the hospitality beyond the state? You know, if someone knocks at your door, that is a political relation, it's a social relation, that is something that exists that you can accept or not, and you build. But since there is a state, we don't have that power. You know, actually, what they do in Europe, if you do it, you are in prison. They get you to prison. You know, if you decide, you know, to get someone that, you know, is illegal and all of that. You see, we built a crazy world. Meanwhile, before, you know, that was, you know, an agency that you have. We have been removed, so the problem is not the refugees. The problem is the citizen. That, you know, we didn't realize that there is an erosion of what the citizen actually can do. We are not even allowed to have people in our private space. Imagine that, you know, we get into this point that we can be criminalized because we are hosting someone. So my point is that from the refugee camp, you can understand, you know, not only the figure of the refugees, but actually how, you know, as a citizen, you can regain, for example, the right to hospitality. I want to have the right to have someone in my house, you know, and not be feeling that, you know, we are illegal. At Calais, there are people who have been, you know, arrested and persecuted because, you know, they were hosting people in their private space, the most sacred space of this capitalist society. And that is where the contradiction, you know, explodes in our face.
What is a camp? It looks like a city, but it's not. It doesn't look like a camp, but it is one. I like this formula very much. I can see the red light blinking, and I think we are out of time. I would like to thank Alessandro, Carlos, Delia, Raj, and Admi for this great discussion. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon.